Welcome to the Massey Dialogues. My name is Nathalie Des Rosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is located on Indigenous land, the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We acknowledge the stewardship of the land and pay our respects and express our gratitude for the ability that we have to gather here and pursue our activities. Today is Orange Shirt Day. It's a day where we commemorate the legacy of the residential schools and honor the journey of survivors and their family in healing to the extent that they can. It comes from a very painful story of Jack Westbat, who was told the first day she arrived in school at 6 years old, wearing a fabulous orange shirt that her grandmother had just given her, was told to remove it. And it became, I think, a symbol of the way in which the residential schools were trying to undermine Indigenous heritage in all the children that attended them. So today, I think we pay our respects and acknowledge that it happened and that we have a duty to all of us, a duty to know that it did happen. It's also a day, I think, where we are challenged to see again the incidents of racism and the care of Joyce Echaquan in the hospital in Joliette in Quebec, who was insulted by the nurse who was supposed to take care of her shortly before her death. It's a very painful reminder that racism continues to be ever so present. Earlier, I'm sure we're going to talk about this as well. We saw the beating of Indigenous Chief Alam Adam. So Massey is a place of knowledge and exchanges, and it must fulfill its duty to increase knowledge among all of its members about themes that have been ignored in the past. And that's what we've been trying to do this week. So I want to thank Chief Laforme and Councillor Emma Farrell for their help in constructing the program for this week. We've been talking about the aftermath of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report, the role of treaty yesterday, and today we're going to talk about policing. I have with me three fabulous speakers. I just want to thank them for being here, and I can't wait to hear their wisdom on this subject. First, we have the Honorable Harry Laforme. He's Anishinaabe of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in Ontario. He was born and mostly raised on the reserve and continued to remain active in the First Nations government. He graduated from Osgoode Hall and then went to be called to the bar and practiced at Osler Hoskin Harcourt. Prior to becoming a judge, he served as Chief Commissioner of the Indian Commission of Ontario, the Chair of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Land Claims. He was appointed judge in 1994, and in November 2004, he was appointed a judge at the Ontario Court of Appeal, the first Indigenous judge ever appointed to an appellate court in Canada's history. He retired in October 2018, is now practicing law with Aldous Clear and Townsend. He's been honored with many gifts of numerous eagle feathers, including by the National Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and he has also many honorary doctorates from York University, Windsor, University of Toronto, the Law Society of Ontario, and Nipissing University, and he is a Senior Fellow at Massey College. Thank you so much for being here with us. Then I will have James Bird, who is a member of the Northwest Territories Métis Nation and is affiliated with the Athabasca Chippewa First Nations. He holds an honors BA in Indigenous Studies and Renaissance Culture. He's currently working on his Masters of Architecture at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture at University of Toronto. He was part of the team that went to the Biennale with Doug Cardinal, and he's been receiving many awards, and he is a fabulous Junior Fellows, and I am so grateful that he is here with us today in this difficult day for him and for his family. He is a member of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's Indigenous Task Force on Architecture, and he's one of the founding members of Indy, Incubator for Northern Design and Innovation, and he also founded a charity for lunch programs for elementary school in remote flying northern communities. So we're very grateful for his continued leadership on the issues of Indigenous heritage at Massey College and at University of Toronto more generally. And then finally, we'll have Chief Stacey Laforme. He's Chief of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. He is an honorary Senior Fellow at Massey College, and he's a new member of our governing board. Thank you so much for accepting to join us there. Chief Laforme has participated in a number of committees and boards throughout his 14 years as a counselor and then chief, including, I think he was a real driving force behind making the Pan Am Games more responsive to Indigenous communities. He's been involved in increasing knowledge and communication, both off and on reserve with his members. His dedication to the history, the language, the culture of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation is really a lightning force for all of us. He's a noted poet, a storyteller. One of his poems, Remember, is engraved in the Veterans Memorial, and his recent book of poetry, Living in the Tall Grass, Poems of Reconciliation, was published in 2018. Welcome, Chief Laforme. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Justice Laforme. Topic today is policing. And there have been deaths of Indigenous men and women at the hands of police for a long time in Canadian history. Indeed, I think we might want to say that Canadian history was framed around a policing power to use the state power of policing against Indigenous people, outlawing many of their cultural practices. So there's been calls for change, but it seems to be so difficult to change. Can you just help us understand what's going on here?
Well, I think to understand is fairly simple. One of the things I discovered about myself is that as I got older, I got angrier, and I think that came with the education and the things that I learned as a professional, and forced me to look at the history of Indigenous Canadian relations really, really in depth and in all facets of life. And in every one that I examined, and I found that it was not very helpful to Indigenous people or reconciliation. And in fact, it all flows out of this notion of literally annihilation of First Nations people, of Indigenous people. I mean, we should never forget that the things that happen to the survivors of residential schools, and when I say survivors, I think it's fair to say that there are survivors of horrendous conduct and behavior by people at these schools. That is absolutely true. But each one of us Indigenous people on this panel are survivors as well, because the whole purpose of residential schools was to get rid of us. And we're still here. So we survived that horrible history. And that's one thing that we should never forget. And I think people tend to forget that whole purpose. I wrote an article once, and it was about whether the proper term for what took place and the policy of residential schools was cultural genocide. And I had authors that offered the opinion that this was not a genocide. This was something other than genocide, and it was awful, they will admit, but it does not constitute genocide. And I completely disagree with that, and I supported it as lawyers are wont to do, or as judges are wont to do, with the necessary authority and everything that goes with it. And there's no question in my mind that it was cultural genocide. Now, before I get into policing, let me just say, Orange Day is really special to me for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which that it's in honor of Indigenous people and our history and our place, hopefully, in this country. but it also represents the color of my birth. I'm a Halloween baby, and orange is important to Halloween, as you know. Okay, so talk about policing. As you pointed out, Nathalie, policing has literally been, and some will argue that it still is, the tool with which this cultural genocide takes place. It's always been an instrument that assists in the policies that were laid out for Indigenous people from the beginning. And we shouldn't forget that the policy of Indigenous people, which became constitutionally entrenched in the British North America Act and became a constitutional provision of Canada's governing structure. It was like as anyone knows, the constitutional law is the first law of our land, and everything that we legislate has to flow from that constitution. So we, as wards of the state or less than equal of everyone else, is a constitutional provision. That's what gives rise to the Indian Act. That's what allows the government of Canada to pass legislation that is the Indian Act. And that gives the government of Canada, at least according to our Constitution, the right to define us and to regulate every part of our life if they so choose. And therein lies one of the deep problems, and that's that constitutional provision. In fact, that constitutional provision is one of the obstacles for Canada adopting full and completely the Universal Declaration of Aboriginal Rights, the UNDRIP that everybody says is going to happen. It's contrary to our Constitution. It can't happen the way they suggest. In terms of policing, policing was the instrument with which early policy was enforced. The responsibility of policing in Canada vis-a-vis Indigenous people was to take our children from us, to take them to another place and put them in residential schools. It was to enforce the law against the parents that chose not to do that, to put them in prison if they didn't let their children go with the police. It also was there, and the police enforced it when those parents wanted to go visit their children in residential schools. And that carried on through a century. So the whole role of Indigenous people and their relationship with police, you can imagine what that was like. I mean, that was enforcing them against their traditions. For example, when the outlawing of dancing and the assembly of Indigenous people, police enforced the policies that came out of the Indian Act, for example, that prohibited people from going off the reserve. They enforced the laws that prohibited people from drink. These were policies as well that they enforced. Indigenous people who couldn't drink in beverage halls, for example, they would get arrested for that. And in other words, they were just part of the enforcement of that genocidal policy that we lived with early on. There's examples even today. There's examples, and we're going to talk about that. And you mentioned it at the outset. That was Chief Adams. Lest people think that this whole notion of people, of police treating Indigenous people differently than other people, all you need to do is watch that video of Chief Adams and his spouse being literally assaulted by those police. For what? I have no idea. And it couldn't have been that urgent that they needed to beat those people and take them away the way they did. We knew this. We started to appreciate that the police were an instrument of, I think, genocide, although we didn't appreciate it at the time, but was part of what developed out of the recognition that the white paper policy was developed and was supposed to then be a gentler form of removing Indigenous people from the history of Canada. That was, as everyone knows, or should know, was responded to by Indigenous people. They formed political organizations across the country. And I was fortunate enough in the early days of that movement to become executive director of one of those organizations called the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians. And we were actually located at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford.
Yeah.
And as people may know, that was the notorious mush hole. That was a residential school. And the custodians of that residential school became friends of mine. I was literally by myself. That's where our office was located for the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians. And my visitors every day were survivors of that residential school. And so I got to learn a little bit about that. Anyways, one of the things we decided that we needed to look at was Indigenous people policing themselves, because that wasn't taking place. Policing is a big deal. 70,000 police officers in Canada today, over 70,000, and fewer than 2,000 are directly engaged in Indigenous policing. That's a fact today. But back in those days, the whole idea of we were trying to use the system to develop the existing system, the colonial system that we had to develop a policing of Indigenous communities. And that didn't really travel very far, and it wasn't accepted. We did it again when I was the Indian Commissioner of Ontario in a tripartite process. And I think that's when the first policing agreement was developed. And that agreement was that it was a trilateral agreement, federal, provincial, and Indigenous communities agreed that we would try this program of Indigenous people. And in one form or another, that has evolved. And so we get these police forces now for Indigenous communities, like Six Nations chief. I don't know if they police our reserve or not, but okay, they have Indigenous police force. Wikwemekong has some. Anishinaabe probably has the largest. They have 35 detachments in NAN communities across Northern Ontario. They're covered by Treaty Number 9 and Treaty 5. This area is really vast. And estimates are it's about the size of France that these police officers police. The difficulty with those police forces is that they're by agreement. They're made by agreement. They get their enforcement powers from the OPP and in some instances, like in BC, from the RCMP. The difficulty is they never have enough funding.
Yeah.
They're always on agreements that have lapsed. And so the security of Indigenous police forces is very little. It's minimal. In the early days, in the early 90s, the police from Indigenous policing forces were looked upon by the OPP and other police forces, and they would take the best candidates that were policing from those communities, and they would encourage them to join the OPP. Yeah, so we lost them that way as well. Mm-hmm. And that policing started, and as I say, they get paid less. Many times they don't have any cells to put anybody in. Their enforcement comes from the enforcement of criminal laws, like the criminal code and everything like that. The ability to enforce regulations from a reserve community or bylaws from a reserve community are almost non-existent. It's almost pointless because the fact of the matter is nobody will prosecute those offenses anywhere. And we don't have courts in our communities. So we have to prosecute these First Nation offenses like our regulations, our bylaws, and indeed any kind of Indigenous law that gets passed by our communities can't get enforced in the courts of Canada. Nobody's willing to do that. The prosecutors won't do it. It's a waste of time. The police don't do it themselves. And so the whole point of Indigenous policing, and they are a remarkable force of police officers because they do this with less than optimum circumstances. I mean, they get paid less. Their facilities are not. It's disgraceful. And yet everybody knows this. And all the governments know this. And they know what the problems are. And like everything else, there's promises, but never anything happens. We understand the problem, but as far as it goes, is the understanding of the problem. And I mentioned Chief Adams and what happens there. You mentioned the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That takes place all the time. They simply don't understand what it takes to police an Indigenous community. They don't want to understand what our culture is and how we interact and what our belief systems are. They don't know any of it. They simply don't want to. They don't take our complaints seriously. As you know, the missing and murdered inquiry spoke about that. You stand at a desk, it's not important. Photographs of victims they use mug shots if they were ever arrested, rather than something that a granddaughter, this is my granddaughter who went missing, this is my daughter who went missing. They'd rather use the mug shot than something like that as part of it. That's how seriously police take the conduct of Indigenous people. Well, I won't go on and on because I'm sure.
Well, we'll bring James to speak a little bit about his perspective on it. I mean, James, I know it's been very painful to discuss this, so but I think we know that it was your chief that was beaten up. So how do you, when you hear Justice Laforme describing this enterprise, the genocidal project, in a way that was, how does it make you feel?
Well, when this whole, brought up this issue about policing, for me, I had to go and get my eagle feather to protect myself, and I feel protection with that because it was given to me by a chief. And so it's a scary topic, actually, because I have direct, I have experience with the police. And this is of my opinion, in my opinion only, but I know of some chiefs in the Northwest Territories that feel this. And I'm under the impression, from firsthand experience, that one of the primary purposes of the RCMP is to enforce the Indian Act. And that's just from my own experience of watching trappers being charged in Wood Buffalo National Park, which is really traditional Dene territory in the Northwest Territories, Dene Sulana, and then watching the chief from Fort Chipewyan. My legacy is from Fort Chipewyan, Athabasca, where Alan Abbs is from. My parents went to residential school at Holy Angels there. My grandparents went to residential school there. And then we were moved to Fort Smith because there was no hospital. Anyway, and there's a residential school in Smith that 5 of my 9 siblings attended. But I tell you, part of that was enforced by the RCMP. My experience mostly is with the RCMP, and it's because of the remoteness, and mostly they're in reserves, at least in Northern Alberta and Northwest Territories, actually all of the Northwest Territories. And so it's a discussion that, my expertise is in architecture, actually, and it isn't in law, although the RCMP has enforced, I felt the enforcement of the Indian Act. My father died in 2007, and there was talk about whether we should call the Indian agent before we read his will. And that's part of the Indian Act. Justice Laforme knows that very well, that there's many things that a lot of Canadians don't know that they can do freely, but at any time the government could take its passport away from me. Because I'm a ward of the state, actually. I'm not a Canadian citizen. And so it's, I talk about it with careful words, because I know that there are big ears with the police. And I'm careful now because I know the long arm and what they're capable of. I don't think I think a part of the way forward is really reform. I don't know how that looks, or that has to come, I think, from the Privy Council or the Prime Minister's office. But something certainly must change. I have to tell you, though, where my hope comes from, it comes from the Dene prophecy about the time we're going through. And we call that time the time that Mother Earth is about to take back her sovereignty. Zose dans les temps, it's not. You know, and so my peace and my hope comes from my ways of knowing, and that's the Dene way of knowing. The Dene mixed with some Métis, because I have some of that too. But I was raised by my Dene grandmother. My mother died when I was a child, and she taught me a lot of how I am. You know, one of the reasons I'm in university at the age I am, at 56, finishing university, is because of residential school. I never had that chance, and you know, hopefully in a year's time I'll enter the PhD program in architecture, and if I'm successful, I'll be the first Native Canadian to hold a PhD in architecture. That's exciting, but it's also very sad. Very sad. And we work hard to be where we're at. And I know that sometimes we have to work harder, but that's okay. I'm used to that. I'm grateful for where I'm at. I'm grateful to be able to talk about this very important topic, you know, with the people I'm talking with. I'm so grateful. Massey Cho.
Well, thank you so much, James. I know it's a very difficult and emotional subject, because we know we can feel the pain that is breathing through this years and legacies of racism. So, Chief Laforme, you are such a wise counsel on these issues as well, and now you are in the position of moving the agenda. What do you see as some solution or the future of how do we get out of this mess?
Well, as before I mention it, I guess I know, Nathalie, that earlier I shared something with you.
Yes.
Called Orange Shirt Day, because one of my counselors, Councilor Veronica, said, "Are you going to write anything for Orange Shirt Day?" And I said, "Oh, of course." And I wrote this. So if you don't mind, I'll read this first.
Oh, good.
It's called simply Orange Shirt Day. Removal of children from homes, removal from nature, removal from culture, removal from language, customs, and practice, removal from everything they have ever known, removal from love. I cannot think of the pain and horror of those lost and those survived without tears welling up, without anger entering my heart. Tears are cleansing, so we do not deny them, but we rise above the anger, because your treatment of us in the past cannot control us today. That was the very intent of the residential school system, to control us, to take away who we are. And it did not work then, and it will not work now. Today and every day, we remember who we are. Today and every day, we remember those stolen. Today and every day, we remember those who never returned. Today and every day, we remember those who lived through the residential school system and those who live through it still. Very good, Chad. I think it's important, you know, and having this conversation about policing on this day is a very good connection. So make way for that process. You know, before I talk about, as I see it, an opportunity for my First Nation and other First Nations, I just wanted to reflect on something that the other two speakers made me think about. And one of those issues was when Mr. Bushi was killed and shot, and by the farmer. One of the most enlightening and saddest things that ever happened after that to me was when a young mother told me after the ruling she says, no, what am I supposed to do? How do I tell my children that they're not safe in this country? How do I tell my children that because of their color, they have to be extra, extra careful? That was heartbreaking to hear that from a young mother. But that's sort of the things that we're talking about in the broad spectrum of policing issues. You know, there are so many things out there and reasons why we have to move in a different direction, I believe. You know, but one of the things that really opened the eyes of some of the chiefs, I believe, was during the pandemic, and Harry mentioned this, that many, many chiefs found out that their policing systems, their laws mean absolutely nothing because it won't be enforced. And then to deal with that, the federal government said, well, if you write us a letter and say you want this bylaw recognized under the Indian Act, in this instant we'll waive that and we will allow the courts to prosecute this. And for me, you know, that's not the direction that we want to go. So anyway, I'm going to try and squeeze into 5 minutes 50 papers I have in front of me about where we're going with policing and governance. And keep in mind, I'm going to talk about peacekeepers, but you have to keep in mind that the peacekeepers I'm taking out of the broad governance structure that we're creating, because I want the peacekeeper part of it to be the lead part of the story. So as I talk about the peacekeepers, I'm also talking about developing the other systems that support and interact at the same time. So what we're proposing to start is simple. You know, we'll train a few members. They'll become local. You know, they'll have uniforms. They'll have vehicles. Uniforms is a hard, not maybe the word that I want to use. They'll have some type of traditional garb or something that recognize them as peacekeepers, and their role will be to start simply glorify neighborhood watch. They'll simply look after the community, drive around and see if something's going on. They'll have a relationship with the existing OPP, and you know, they'll call them and they'll do work with them, and all this time they'll receive training, and they'll be in charge of say if you're going away for the weekend, you call us up and say, hey, I'm going to be gone all week. Can you check on my home? Can you do this or that? And they say, sure. So you build relationships and you build trust. If there's services needed, you connect that service to mental health or mental well-being or those types of things, instead of, you know, this is drastically a police matter that must be dealt with. So it's important to build that trust on the ground in the beginning, so that when you're policing your own communities, you don't have that mistrust of, oh, you're going to favor so-and-so, you're going to not treat us fairly. But if you develop that relationship on the very first starting place, it can build over time and you can have that trust. From there, we will train them, and eventually they will start to get more and more abilities, guided by us, but fundamentally only under the constitutional allowance of what can be done. But that's up to a certain point, right? And all this time we'll be doing training of what it is in the RCMP, the OPP, and the culture and heritage of the Anishinaabe or the Indigenous people will be all tied into that. And at a certain point, we will start developing legislation around what these peacekeepers are allowed to do. And we'll give them jurisdiction. We'll make a mandate under legislation that we create that will allow them to take further and further steps. Keep in mind, at the same time this is going on, we're still building our government functions around us. We're still working with the Canadian system at this point in time because we're so entwined that we need them and we recognize this. But as we go beyond that, we'll start legislating, we'll start giving more authority. They'll be answerable to their own people as opposed to, you know, the constitutional direction of the OPP and the RCMP. And but one of the key parts of this is while we build this and we build the jurisdictional models, we will break off some of the peacekeepers and we will allow them to be form part of our security companies. Some of them will have responsibilities in the area of parks and recreations, water stewardships. So they'll be able to be bringing back funds that can go back into the governance and the Peacekeeper systems, so that we will actually be funding our own systems, our own models, as we build it forward. So as they branch off in security, they branch off into land guardians, water guardians, just for names. The funds will funnel back into, and will grow the ability of the peacekeepers. Now, we recognize that the Mississaugas, as a credit, are going to be hard pressed when we get to a certain point, and we're going to need allies and other Indigenous people to work with us in this. Otherwise, it becomes so difficult for one First Nations to do what we're talking about, because eventually we want to have our own courts, our own lawyers, our own judges, all these systems in place that are needed for the legislative process. And well, there's many more aspects of this, as you can probably guess. You know, the training is continuous. The relationships are, and one of the fundamental things about this process is I'm giving you a snapshot of a model that's based upon our community only. But if we bring in other nations to begin with, the model will change, and we can move ahead a little bit of the process wise, because I recognize that this is a model that's going to be probably I won't see the conclusion of it in my lifetime, simply because of all of the work and all the structures that have to be put in place, and the alliances and partnerships that have to be built. But fundamentally, we already have the ability to do all of this because we're sovereign people, and so we do not need to seek partners with the province or the feds. We work with them, but we have our own way, and we should follow our own way. I met with the provincial and federal people who deal with Indigenous policing, and we had a conversation, and they said, well, we have these different policing, and Harry mentioned one of them, models that First Nations use, but they said, but none of them get to where you want to go. None of them can facilitate what you want to do. And keep in mind, once we're far enough ahead, there are other agencies and services that could use peacekeepers. Right now, you have fear of organizations that are off reserve. So organizations that have to deal with very sensitive issues, and where police frightened or people are scared of or don't want to interact with, why not use our own people as some type of service that can help with that and engage with those, as opposed to the perspective of what does the police service look like. You know, some people will say that it's that we can't do it because of this reason and that reason, but I say watch us.
Yes, I believe in watching you. I think, but it's an interesting concept to start with the peacekeeper and building relationship as the essence of policing, and coming from the bottom up in a way is what you're suggesting. Let's bring everybody together. Then that seems like a fairly hopeful, imaginative, creative, positive way of responding. How different is it than what was imagined in the 70s, Justice Laforme? Like when you were trying to imagine this sort of Indigenous policing, is it that it was based on existing models or what?
No, and in the 70s, in and around the late 60s and early 70s, some Indigenous people understood where we were in Canada and where we came from and where we probably needed to go. But the vast majority of us were conditioned by where we were in that point in time in history. And the chief's ideas were wishful thinking in a lot of people, but it was, at the time, it was how to move this forward within existing systems and within the existing place that we occupied in Canada at the time. I mean, a lot of this stuff rolled out afterwards. And, you know, sometimes I say as I got older and the more I knew, the angrier I got about what our place was in history. And I think there's some truth to that, because as I learned all of these things that took place, and one simply led to another. I didn't know, for example, in 1971, the state of policing in Canada. I just assumed that they looked after us like they did everyone else. And then you learn that that's not the case. And a lot of people understood that. So we were trying to put in policing as we knew it to be, and as we knew it to be was within the existing police forces. And we didn't have the creativity, or at least certainly I didn't, and some of the people I knew. We learned it after a while, which is the beauty of our elders and the treasures that our elders are, because they teach us this. And we've since moved along. And I think, for example, the idea that the chief has are ideas that a lot of First Nations, if not all of them, aspire to now, but don't know how to move it forward. But that's okay, because, you know, we at least know where we are now, and we have an idea of where we want to go. And really, that's where you have to start, isn't it? I mean, you just have to have these big ideas, and then you start. My dad used to say all the time, you know, you can't eat an elephant whole, but you sure can eat them one bite at a time. And that's what we have to do. That's where we start now. And of course, with policing, the difficulty is not so much with the policing itself, and from an Indigenous perspective, a First Nations perspective, it's everything that follows upon policing. If you're going to, for lack of a better word, charge somebody with an offense, what do you do with that offense? Where do you take it? How do you enforce it? A serious offense, for example, what do you do with that? Where do you prosecute it? Like, I mean, where do you pass judgment on whether or not that offense occurred? And then what do you do with that offender afterwards? And those are the difficult things that we have to struggle through. And simple policing it's the beginning of the issue. It's not, and the chief is quite right. Policing isn't going to work, because policing for Indigenous people is like I was mentioning at the outset about the student body, the people that make up some of our universities. And they say, if you're going to put police in here, we want nothing to do with them. There's a real serious issue of trust, and it's legitimate. That issue of trust is earned. Like we have a right to think that way, because our entire history, including today, as witnessed by Chief Adams, and all you have to do is watch that video, you will see that there is a relationship there that is completely broken. It's probably very much like the relationship we have with Canada. It's a broken relationship. We know that. And that's what reconciliation's about, is to fix it. Reconciliation and something with police, the instruments of enforcement of those policies and laws that existed to literally cause cultural genocide, they're real, and they're still there. And there's anger there from police, and there's anger from people as well that say, why are you so special? If you know your history, it's not special, we're different. We're different. And equality requires treating different people different ways.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the sovereignty aspect of it is essential. It comes from recognizing the ability to carve a policy around what you need, which is, you know, start with the trust and then build a peacekeeping vision that is that seems to resonate at least with the people that are there, you know, that it speaks to and so on, and the needs of the community. James, I wanted to bring you in. What's your, do you see this as a model that could reflect Dene wisdom, or is it at all, is it possible to imagine that it's a model that, you know, could emerge from the exercise of sovereignty elsewhere in Canada?
Well, I believe anything's possible. I really do. I believe that Native people are know how to survive. We've done it. We weren't supposed to be here. We're still here. So, you know, I'm here. I'm in school at my age. I quit. I don't believe in. I believe that anything's possible, and I believe, though, in my community, we practice, or have attempted actually, and successfully attempted, restorative justice.
Yeah.
And I think if that could really be thought out clearer and really supported by the Department of Justice, federally and provincially, and in my case, territorially, and allow that justice system to work. I've seen it work. I've seen young people rehabilitated through restorative justice. I think, you know, I think if we were allowed to practice our forms of governing our people when they go astray, you know, so whenever I'm invited to talk with this, I always want to leave, and maybe I'm just being a fool, but I don't think I am actually, leaving on a positive note of, so, you know, we know the horrors. We spend hours talking about how horrific it is to be Native in Canada, and I know I'm one of them, and I experienced it. But so where do we really go from here? What does that mean? And you know what it is for me? The young people. That's where the hope is. It's that healing of the 7 generations that are coming up now. And the young people who become lawyers or become doctors and architects. I mean, a society built within a society that there's hope, because these young people now that are being born in First Nations communities, they're different. And we were told of them coming to help us. Zona Zelate, the young people who in Yakotose or Yakadani in Dene is the angels. So I'm always hopeful. I think that Native people are very we're very durable. We don't give up. Always optimistic, and we're always grateful in everything that's happened. You know, the whole issue around racism, that's something I just don't understand. And I think a lot of that comes out of fear. I think it's fear-based. I was told once in a Sundance ceremony by Wambadi, Lakota chief, we had talked about, I don't know how it came up, we had been talking about racism, and he really was in the belief that a lot of that is just fear-based. And nobody's going nowhere. You know, we all have to appreciate and understand. I guess the thing for me, though, and I'll end with this, is that my way of knowing the world is my Dene way of knowing the world, and that'll never change. And I think there's a lot to give Canada. I think Indigenous people continue to have a lot to give Canada. So, you know, this Idle No More movement that came up over the summer, and it's a real wake-up call. And at least this is the way I've taken it. The pandemic has forced a lot of people to spend time on their own and contemplate. You know, if you're wise, you're thinking about the future, right? Anyways, so maybe I'm a fool for being an optimist, but I don't think so. I instead of optimism, I like the word hope. Yeah. I'm hopeful for the future. Hosanna. Yeah. So thank you.
And I want to say, James, I was thinking about you when the chief was speaking about this new concepts of peacekeeper as opposed to police officer. It evoked new ways of thinking about architecture in terms of what type of institutions and needs to be created. And I'm sure that there's lots of reflections about what type of building do you need to have peace builders.
You know, one of the
Yes,
theories.
and I see both of yes, Justice Laforme, and then Chief responding to your comment. I know people. If you want to ask your questions, please put your questions on YouTube, and I will give them to you. Please, Justice Laforme.
Okay. I guess the thing that I wanted to talk about was the police. It's been said and it's been described throughout North America lately that the whole idea of policing anywhere has changed. And if it's changed for society as a whole, then you can imagine how it's changed and it's perceived from Indigenous communities. But the change is this: policing was about serve and protect. That's disappeared in policing. And many have theorized that part of that comes from the way we've militarized our police forces. You know, we dress them out in armor now and shields and helmets, and the protection part, the serve, it has disappeared. There's no essence of service anymore, which takes me to the point that the chief was making, and others have said this as well, and that's why they don't want policing as part of their security measures, because policing is enforcement only. Yeah. And that's the perception that people have of it now. Peacekeeper talks about the beginning, the first part of that commitment that police officers used to make to serving the community. And we need to get that back. And how to get that back sometimes is they have to understand what we talk about in life and don't always think about things in colonial terms. Yeah. I can give you a good example of that. On the issue of whether or not First Nations could have casinos on a reserve as an Aboriginal or treaty right. Yeah. In the early days of that, Section 835, the courts listened to what the Indigenous people had to say, which was, sure, we used to have races and and it was literally issues of chance and betting and things like that. And the court said, no, that's not what gambling is about. Gambling is about cards, dice, horse races, and betting on those things. The idea of shifting into gaming as part of an Indigenous cultural reality, ancient, just was foreign to their concept. And so an Indigenous right to, for example, enter into gaming just didn't exist from the perspective of the judiciary. And that's just simply wrong. You have to shift away from everything is not because that's the way they did it in Europe.
Yeah. That's all right. So, Chief, with your reflections on what James was talking about, yes.
I want to say, yeah, we, as I said, it's a large document, and restorative justice and other practices that are ongoing are considered in part of that document, and how we maintain them and how we use them and how they can be incorporated into the systems that exist now and in the future as part of that. But I just wanted to say that, you know, I'm not a naive person. I know that anytime I've ever made a plan and started on a journey to the end of that plan, that along the way it changes. Things adapt, the world around us changes, and adaptation changes. And so, you know, the vision that you see, you can only start that vision. Yep. You know, you can go as far as you can go, but somebody else may change that vision. Somebody else may take it in a different direction. Quite frankly, you know, once this becomes a popular method, how will Canada respond to First Nations actually taking up this jurisdiction? How would they think? Well, you can see that there'd be some concern with regards to having two systems in a Canadian society, and how they would function together. So you would notice, but just the action of moving forward can spur change in regards to how that could work. I mean, maybe they realize that the Indigenous perspective is a better model than the policing perspective. Maybe they come to embrace the peacekeeper model, and the peacekeeper model becomes a more broader Canadian perspective as opposed to a simply Indigenous perspective of where we're going. So I'm happy, starting this little journey for ourselves and hopefully find allies and partners. But I'm happy wherever it comes out to be, and whoever changes it and makes it better in the future.
Little journey.
Yes. Well, I mean, we're coming to the end of the hour, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to really make some final remarks to our audience. Like, what should non-Indigenous people get from this? I mean, I'm listening to the chief, and I say, well, maybe by the time this evolves, maybe some Canadians who have gotten it, some people may have kind of paid attention and tried to recognize that their framework has been also created by a colonial way, and if they want to move out of that place, there's lots of listening to do, but there's some action that needs to be taken. Anyway, I was going to ask you, Justice Laforme, to begin.
I'm going to pick up where James commented, and that is the hope for young people, the next generation. I can say this: I helped teach a law class at the University of Toronto, and it's kind of a seminar course, which means that there are graduate students there. There are people that are working on master's degrees in law, et cetera, et cetera. And if any of them are Indigenous, they haven't identified yet as one. But here's my point. When they study the documents that we tell them about how treaties were entered into and how they're interpreted and who did what on treaty day and what the ultimate transaction, the treaty, manifested itself into, these students to a person are offended.
Yeah.
They're genuinely offended. They don't understand how we could do that to each other. Yeah. And when you see that and you hear that genuine offense over something that 5 years ago nobody cared about or said, well, that's the deal they entered into, so what? A deal is a deal. It's done. We did have one time where the whole supremacy of Parliament was assumed, and it was the law, and it was an understood law, and too bad, too sad, but Parliament, or the government of Canada, was allowed to enter into a treaty with Indigenous people, give them everything they wanted on Monday, and take it all back through the passage of a law on Tuesday. That was understood to be the law. And so when you've got young people being offended about the transactions and the instruments and the history, then that's a pretty good start.
Yeah. Good. So James, any final remarks? What would you want listeners to take out of this dialogue?
I think our Canadian citizenship, and all Canadians, there's a responsibility with the relationship with Indigenous people. And I think anytime there's an opportunity to learn, like I have to learn about colonial ways of knowing, I think the opportunity to learn and to actually take time and read documents like the Indian Act to really understand fundamentally how we're governed actually. And that the fact that piece of legislation in 2020 is still official legislation. So education, I think people need to take the time to understand us as Indigenous peoples across Canada. And I always refer back to that document because it is the cause of many problems and also would help people to understand. So I think, I'm always hopeful. I just, and I leave it with that. I just, that's where my hope is in building relationships. It's all about relationships. And opportunity to learn.
Thank you. And today it certainly is our opportunity to listen. I'm going to leave the last word to the chief here.
Thank you very much. Thanks, gentlemen. I really enjoyed spending some time with you. You too, Natalie. That was fantastic way to spend my afternoon. You know, this country and the laws that govern this country were made by a largely white society. And frankly, that's not what it is anymore.
Yeah.
You know, when you talk, if you're just talking about Canadian society and Indigenous people, you look at the circle of life, if you will. And if Indigenous people are here on the circle of life, and Canadian society is here, you know, with different values, different understanding of the world they live in, and you take one system and superimpose it on another, that's just simply a recipe for disaster, because it never will work. And we're seeing the results of that. But the sad part is, it's not just the Indigenous society that it's forced upon now. That Canadian society and structure is forced upon many, many marginalized people who call this land home. And it's time we recognize that. And it's time we go back to the foundation and look at where we are today. You know, a lot of times when we do our strategic planning, and this is true of many industries and many institutions, we start from where we were now. We start here and we plan for the next 10 years. Well, sometimes you do that, you're building on sand. So you have to back up and go further back and find out where you're building from and where you're creating from. So, you know, one of the things I'll just leave you with is, you know, we're always so busy, caught up in the moment, that we never take the time to think about, is this moment in keeping with who we are or who we want to be? Because if it's not, then we don't do any justice to ourselves or our institutions. I'll leave it with that.
Well, thank you. What a rich conversation, lots of learning and lots of listening that we are doing here together. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom with the Massey community and beyond. And also I want to thank the tech team that makes it all possible. Thank you to Abra and Matt and their team to get us live on air and being able to speak to one another. It was a privilege to listen to you. Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you.